Thank you very much. So I've been already introduced by the host of this session. Thank you. As said, I'm going to talk today about school segregation in Italy with a double aim. First, discussing the potentiality of INVALSI data and what INVALSI data leaves out. Secondly, also in the future, when the project will be more advanced, to provide also a platform for other researchers to have a comprehensive view of the phenomenon in Italy. In Italy, there have been many studies on school segregation, but they're mostly small-scale studies, qualitative studies that are very important, very interesting, but at least we did not find any comprehensive study on the phenomenon, and especially a longitudinal study about the phenomenon. So, first of all, what do we mean by segregation? Probably, when you hear segregation, you think deliberate processes driven by classism or racism or sexism or other isms that are deliberately enacted by some social groups in order to exclude others. While we adopt a more wider definition that is also more relevant to our purpose, which is the extent to which individuals from different social groups are de facto spatially segregated from one another. And we can have segregation in the workplace, we can have segregation in residential areas, we can have segregation at school, we can have segregation within the public administration, etc., etc., etc. Now, segregation is interesting for various reasons. One of the which it is both as relevant as an outcome of processes and as a starting point as a causal factor to determine life chances of individuals. As an outcome, interestingly, typically we refer to segregation as the outcome of deliberate processes. And this is, it happened a lot of times in history, but also it has a problem that if you concentrate too much on the outcome of the deliberate process, we ignore the fact that much of segregation might actually be produced by simply homophilous processes. It has been proven that even a small preference for the in-group generates in the medium term high levels of segregation. And in this case it is more problematic because there is not much that we can do by addressing flaws in the system. So it is also less clear what we can do to fight it. As outcomes, it has also been studied, especially under the umbrella term of peer effects. Much of this literature is struggling with how to measure and how to apply peer effects model to existing data. There are some studies that have been conducted in Italy exactly using INVALSI data. Normally, it is difficult sometimes to judge the robustness of the studies, but normally the basic idea is that segregation is influential, even if we do not know for which students and in which conditions. So what we do in this study that is still at its early stages, it is to calculate using the INVALSI data for the period 2010-2019 two different indexes. Another problem with segregation is that there are lots of ways in which you can conceive and measure segregation, which poses additional challenges. We started by calculating the similarity and exposure index, and also then we will discuss about what we can do and what we cannot do with INVALSI data that are actually the most complete database that we found for this purpose. So we use data from grades 2, 5, and 8. We will show only grades 2 and 8 because grades 2 and grade 5 are quite similar. We will use we will study between school segregation. So we will use a smaller level of aggregation school building for a moment as a catching area, we use province, but results do not change that much when we skip to other type of aggregation, and we will study what happens for segregation based on migration background of kids or education of the parents, which is a proxy for instance, for not a good proxy for also economic segregation. Importantly, one of the reasons that pushed us to study this, it is the idea also to provide additional evidence to a long-lasting debate. That is, to what extent tracking reinforces the existing segregation among students and drives students to different pathways. Unfortunately, data of INVALSI cannot help us in this respect because we lack data on one important stream, which is the most segregated one, that are the centri di formazione professionale. And this is also a problem because it's even difficult to retrieve retrieve figures for this type of students. So the students are not in the data, are not in the official documents of the ministry because they are regionally handled. So these students do not exist, basically. And this is a huge problem also because they are the most disadvantaged one. But you will see what we can say about it. So, coming back to our measures, we have two types of indexes. The dissimilarity index is an index. Both they vary between 0 and 1. It studies the uniformity of the distribution of groups across clusters, that is buildings or schools within an area. And the interpretation is quite straightforward, and it is the proportion of individuals that belong to a group that should be relocated in order to have a uniform distribution. Theoretically relocated, obviously. The second type of index is the exposure index, and it measures the exposure of members of a group to members to other specific groups. And what it captures here, it is the probability of a member of group X to be in the same school or in the classes or in the same cluster of members of other groups. So they behave quite differently, and importantly, something that we are reasoning on to, in this period, it is that they are highly sensitive to the relative distribution of groups. So when we interpret the data, we have to be very careful about what we say, because it's very important to take into account how many students for a given group are in a given area. For instance, we cover a period of 10 years where two macro phenomena occurred. The first one, it is that the generations of highly the students that were protagonists of the expansion of schooling became parents and and their kids started to be at school. So we have a huge amount, an increase of the 50% of highly educated mothers, for instance, and a parallel shrink of students from families with no diploma, with no educational, high educational or low or medium educational background. Secondly, something that I find in the data, but I'm not sure whether there was a change in coding, maybe somebody from INVALSI can reassure me about that. It is that there have been a doubling of first-generation migrants within these 10 years, and a shrink of second-generation migrants. And this is something maybe somebody from the literature on migration, if somebody can tell me something. I found it quite strange, and I don't know if something about the data or a phenomenon that really existed. So if somebody has some comment as well. Jumping directly to the results, so we have grade 2 and grade 8 for this 10-year span. This is the similarity index calculated for different groups defined on educational background measures. What we can see is that we have lowly educated parents, parents with a diploma, parents with higher education. So what we see, the most relevant phenomenon, it is that there is quite a stability, except in grade 2 for a small but consistent decline of the dissimilarity index for the sons of graduates, basically. And this is also because their number is increasing, is exploding, actually. In grade 8, we observe a decline. It's very small decline over time. It is difficult to say how small it is, also because this phenomenon are linked with residential segregation, which is a phenomenon very stable over time. So it is also difficult to see how fast this phenomenon, or relevant this phenomenon is, this change is. But what it is important here, it is that in grade 8, segregation is a little bit smaller than in grade 2, also because in grade 2 there are more elementary schools, and the elementary schools have smaller catching areas that tend to be more segregated. So there is less segregation in this sense in grade 8. These are exposure indexes. So from the dissimilarity index, we can think that there is a decreasing phenomenon of segregation, so hooray. But what we see when we look at exposure, we see that the relative dimension plays a counterintuitive role. So we have the exposure of lowly educated kids to kids from highly educated families that are this one, and you see that it is increasing. Why? Maybe because of some phenomena that are occurring in our cities, that is, for instance, gentrification. So there are more, this group, kids from lowly educated families are becoming more, less and less, so they are more exposed. But on the other hand, the new group that is becoming majoritarian, on average, is less exposed to the students. So how can we square this data? So basically, what we observe is that the group of highly educated kids is getting less and less in touch with a minoritarian and more segregated group of lowly educated kids. This is the interpretation that we give to the data. And this is also what happens when we contrast lowly educated kids with a diploma. Now let's go to migration background. This is again the similarity index. We observe a jump. The most important thing that happened during these 10 years is a jump in the similarity index for first generation migrants. In order to achieve, can be interpreted as, in order to achieve a uniform distribution of first generation migrants across elementary school, we should relocate above the 70% of them. This is basically what this graph is telling. And again, in grade 8, again for the bigger catching areas, we see that the numbers are much smaller, but are quite high indeed. It is about 50% of the kids should be relocated to achieve a uniform distribution. Now, what about exposure? So basically, we know that migrants from first generation are increasingly present, and we observe that there is a slight increase of exposure of natives to first generation migrants, a slight increase during these 10 years. However, in parallel with what we saw in the previous graph, you see the jump that we observe here. These migrants, even if more present in the everyday life of our native students, are starting to be more and more concentrated. You see that the exposure to natives is slowly but consistently shrinking. This happens in both grades. This is also something that is happening among second generation migrants. And interestingly, the other thing that is happening, it is that I suspected that migrants were enrolled in the same schools, I thought. Migrants from different, belonging to different groups. While instead, if you see this says, this is 5%, 0.5, 0.1, 0.15, we observe that they are relatively poorly exposed to one another, first generation, second generation migrants. Like if they inhabit different parts of our cities, or at least this is what this data is telling us. I expected a very high exposure rate to of first and second generation migrants, respectively, but this is not happening. So just a few words. We look also started to look also at the territorial distribution. These are the similarity index that were just to make things more easy to show. Kids of highly educated families against the others, and we see that the south and the metropolitan areas of Milan and Rome have the higher levels, and this is also something that is mirrored when we look at the difference between natives and non-natives. So this is basically that in the south there are higher, normally there is a higher level of segregation, and in the north the situation is more scattered, but for instance the metropolitan area of Milan is showing consistently very high levels. So, concluding, as I told you, there are some, when interpreting this data of these descriptives, we're facing with some struggles. First, it is that the first question that might arise is, but then segregation is high or low then? Well, this is quite difficult to tell because we do not have comparable data about residential segregation, and we do not have comparable data about other countries. So if you tell me whether it is high or low, I cannot scientifically answer this. The second thing is that often we attribute many of the flaws of our system to, in terms of quality of educational opportunity, to the tracking system, as we said. However, we cannot, using INVALSI data, we cannot answer how much, how that increases in grade 10 because we do not have the data on the most segregated group. But the data on the other groups show that all the indexes are more or less in line with the one that we calculated in grade 2. So in grade 10, without the most segregated group, we observe a level of segregation that is comparable to grade 2, and so if we added the students, this level of segregation would inevitably, mathematically increase. How much? This is something that we cannot answer with this data. We could do some simulation to see some bandwidth, but it is not something that, if you have any idea about this, please let me know. It would be really, really important for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.